Imagine a Christmas night in the 15th century. No church bells ringing through the frozen air, no carols, no warm candlelight behind shuttered windows, only screams. The night was December 14th, slipping into the early hours of the 15th, 1467. Baia, a small town in Moldavia, on land that today lies within Romania. Snow covered the mud, mud covered the blood, and in the cutting cold, there unfolded a scene so unreal that if someone told it as a story, you would swear it was a legend. The King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, was running for his life. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a step back to strike forward later. Running. A hunted man in the night, as an entire town turned into a furnace. Matthias Corvinus, one of the most powerful rulers in Central Europe, a king towering above nobles, a man who commanded one of the most feared armies of his age, an army so terrifying its enemies whispered its name like a curse, the Black Army. And yet now, he was not riding at the head of his troops. He was bleeding. In the darkness, arrows were buried in his back. 3 wounds, 3 red dots seeping through a heavy cloak. Around him, panic-stricken guards dragged a stretcher, their boots slipping on snow-mixed mud, their breath bursting out like smoke. Above them, wooden walls crackled as they burned. This was not a romantic fire, not flickering, not beautiful. This fire was hunger. It devoured rooftops, beams, doors. The winter wind whipped the flames sideways, forcing them into narrow alleys, turning the entire town into a giant chimney. Thick black smoke clawed at the throat. If you stood close, you would smell something hard to name: pine resin, burning wood, fabric catching fire, and somewhere inside that smoke, the metallic scent of blood. Cold, sharp, like old coins rubbed in wet hands. Bodies lay scattered. Some were knights who never had time to put on armor. They had gone to sleep drunk on plunder, convinced winter and wooden walls were shield enough. They woke in panic, ran into the streets, and learned the truth. In a burning alley, a mounted knight is no longer a tank. He is just a man trapped inside a metal oven. The thicker the armor, the faster the death. But the most terrifying thing that night was not the fire. It was the man who lit it. The hunter chasing the King of Hungary was not a pagan barbarian from propaganda tales, not a distant steppe warlord. He was Matthias's own vassal, a small ruler, often described with words that sound almost gentle: defender of the faith, champion of the Eastern Crusade, shield of Christendom. History remembers him as Stephen the Great, Stefan cel Mare of Moldavia. But the survivors of that Christmas night in Baia, if they still had teeth to speak, if they still had voices to whisper, they would tell you something else. Stephen was not merely a pious man with a sword. He understood war in a way that was ice cold. When you are a small fish swimming among sharks, you do not fight fair. You shatter the tank. Weeks before the catastrophe at Baia, Matthias Corvinus marched his army across the Carpathians into Moldavia, not to negotiate, but to punish. He brought the language empires always bring: 40,000 men, a colossal force by medieval standards, mostly mercenaries and heavy troops, using the familiar Central European method: burn villages, seize grain, starve the land, then force the enemy into open ground, where heavy cavalry turns battlefields into meat grinders. Stephen understood perfectly. If he met Matthias on open ground, on Matthias's terms, Moldavia would be crushed. A small state, a fragile land, trapped between the shadows of Hungary, Poland, and the Ottomans. One mistake, and it would vanish. So Stephen denied Matthias what he needed: not a battle, but a dead land. As the Hungarian army pushed deeper, they found something unsettling. Empty granaries, silent villages, no chickens, no children, no shouting voices. Doors hung half open, creaking in the wind like groans. Wells, some abandoned, some deliberately fouled. The people had vanished into forests and mountains. Food was taken or destroyed. The land was stripped bare, like a forest freshly shaved to the bone. Hunger began to gnaw at discipline. Medieval hunger was not feeling peckish. It was a claw. It turned mercenaries restless, fractured formations from within. And when hunger met cold, cold began killing quietly. On the road to Baia, arrows were not the only killers. Winter fired its own volleys, into lungs, into fingers, into morale. Matthias encamped in Baia, believing he had found winter shelter. Snow, wooden walls, the confidence of the strong. The enemy must have fled. The enemy must be afraid. But Stephen was waiting. On the night of December 14th, as darkness fell like a heavy blanket, 12,000 Moldavian soldiers silently closed the ring. No siege engines, no assault towers, only torches. Picture the moment. In the forest, under the trees. Hands gripping torch handles, sticky pine resin on skin, small flames trembling. No one spoke. Only the soft crunch of snow. Kirk! Kirk! And the sound of breath held back because a single cough could ruin the hunt. Then Stephen gave the signal, and the night exploded. Fire was lit from 3 directions. The 4th was left open. Not for mercy. It was a funnel, an escape designed like the mouth of a predator. Those who ran into it ran straight into slaughter. Flames spread with terrifying speed. Everything was wood. Walls, roofs, gates. The eastern wind turned Baia into a single colossal torch. Hungarian soldiers woke, choking on smoke. Some leapt up barefoot. Some stumbled drunk, eyes burning, half dreaming. They ran into the streets and found figures already waiting in the alleys. Baia's streets were too narrow for cavalry. Numbers meant nothing. Heavy armor became a curse. In a burning alley, a knight in armor locks himself into a furnace. Horses panic, slip, scream. Metal heats, skin burns. And in the sea of fire, Stephen rode in himself. We like to imagine rulers commanding from afar, but chronicles describe him as a blade, driving straight into the heart of chaos, fighting, searching. He did not intend to destroy the entire army. He intended to sever the state. Stephen was hunting Matthias. When Stephen's archers spotted the royal guard, the clearest sign of the king, they loosed a volley. Was! 3 arrows struck. No one knows the exact moment when Matthias realized, I might die here. But we can imagine it. A man used to giving orders, suddenly feeling his limbs go cold, not from snow, but from blood leaving his body. The guards dragged him from the flames. This was no longer retreat. It was flight. Into the mountains. Behind them, comrades burned. Baia burned. A punitive expedition became a night of massacre. Hungarian power, at least for that moment, was broken by a man with fewer men, less wealth, less land, but colder calculations. Morning came. Ash drifted like black snow. The sun rose over smoking ruins, illuminating embers still glowing beneath the wreckage. Stand in Baia then, and you would hear beams collapsing. Crash. Metal cooling with dull pops, and somewhere, the moans of those not quite dead. Men expected Stephen to celebrate. He did not. He turned to his commanders, those who hesitated, those who let Matthias escape. And Stephen did something that froze the army in place. He executed 20 boyars, Moldavia's high nobles, in front of the troops. Records say many more were impaled on the spot, not because he was a bloodthirsty monster, but because Stephen wanted one message burned into every mind. For him, betrayal and weakness were more dangerous than foreign enemies. In that world, a small state does not die because the enemy is many. It dies because it is hollow inside. Matthias understood. Hungary signed peace. For years afterward, Matthias never again led a grand invasion of Moldavia. But if you think this is a happy ending, it is not. Because in the eastern darkness, an empire was watching, like a predator catching the scent of fresh blood. The Ottomans. And on the Ottoman throne sat the man who made Europe tremble. Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople. They looked at Stephen and saw not just a stubborn minor state. They saw a dangerous spark, a man clever enough not to die quickly and hard enough not to kneel. And to understand why Stephen became a man capable of burning his own towns, executing his own nobles, turning war into cold surgery, we must go back. Before Baya. Before he was the Great. Before he was called the Athlete of Christ in European letters. We must return to an autumn night, October 1451, a wedding feast that became a slaughterhouse. That night, in the village of Rossani, people drank and laughed. Music played, plates clattered, meat and bread filled the tables, the kind of things that make people believe life can still be sweet. And because it was a wedding, the guards relaxed. In 15th century Balkan politics, relaxed was not a mistake. It was a death sentence. The door did not open for a late guest. It was smashed apart. Wood exploded. Crack! Music died instantly. The intruder was Petru Aron, Stephen's uncle, with mercenaries at his back. No negotiation, no warning, steel drawn, boots pounding, eyes of a man who came to steal a throne. In a single breath, the wedding hall turned into a killing ground. Tables overturned, wine spilled like blood. Screams tore out of throats meant for songs. And in the chaos, Bogdan II, Stephen's father, the rightful ruler, was cut down. Sources say he was killed on the spot, amid fallen furniture, wine soaking into dirt. Some say his head was taken on the feast floor. A death meant not just to kill a man, but to murder legitimacy itself. Stephen was only a teenager, not a king, not a general. Just a son, standing at the edge of hell, watching his father fall. Life did not give him time to grow up. It snapped childhood like a dry branch. Through steel on flesh, bodies falling, panicked footsteps, the boy slipped into shadow and ran into the night. The autumn air was cold. Not like Baya 16 years later, but cold enough to whiten breath and make the heart ache. That night, Stephen did not just lose his father. He lost his land, his throne, the protection of his name. And worst of all, he learned power's first lesson. Sometimes the one who kills you is not a stranger. It is the man who calls you nephew. From the moment Stephen vanished into the darkness of Rossani, he became a fugitive in his own homeland. Petru Aron's men would hunt him, because as long as Stephen lived, the throne would never be safe. He ran through forests, mountain paths, mud clinging to his heels, wet leaves sticking to his clothes. Every rustle behind him felt like death. Every shadow could hide a knife. He crossed the mountains into Transylvania, then drifted south into Wallachia, a land just as treacherous, just as full of blades, where fate waited with a meeting that would change Eastern Europe forever. Among exiles with no home, Stephen would meet another boy, one whose eyes held the same darkness, a son who had lost his father, a fury with nowhere to go. His name was Vlad Dracula, that name. Centuries later, the world would twist it into a vampire's shadow. But when Stephen fled from Roseni, Vlad was not a legend. Vlad was just a young exile, and inside him was the same fracture Stephen carried. A father betrayed, a throne stolen, a childhood smashed into splinters by history. They didn't meet in a glittering hall. They met in the cold borderlands, where one night's sleep was a wager with death, where kindness could be a trap, where the wind itself sounded like warning. There, between flickering hearth fires and dark rooms that stank of damp wood and old smoke, two teenagers looked at each other and recognized the most painful truth of all. They understood each other without speaking. They were both sons of deaths that were not clean. Bogdan Sakt, Stephen's father, trusted blood and lineage. He paid with his head on a wedding floor. Vlad's father, also a man who had stood close to power, trusted the Boyars. And that trust, in the memory of the age, ended in humiliation and brutality. In their world, the first lesson was not how to hold a sword, it was how to read people. And the second lesson was a sentence as short as a knife. Trust no one. Years later, people would say Vlad was fire, rising, roaring, burning everything in reach. And Stephen was ice, silent, cold, watching. But back then, they were simply two survivors studying the cruelest curriculum ever written, the curriculum of staying alive. They sat in the dark and dissected why their fathers died, not to mourn, to make sure they didn't die the same way. If you put your ear close to that moment, a night in the forest, wind whistling through gaps in a rough door, fire cracking in the logs, you can hear a silence so thick it feels physical. The silence of young men forced to grow up too fast. Vlad had once been a hostage at the Ottoman court. He knew the smell of Islamic imperial power, cold stone corridors, eyes that never slept, rituals both dazzling and terrifying. And Vlad carried an idea like a disease: terrorize the enemy, so they don't dare to breathe. Stephen was different. Stephen looked at fear and saw a problem. Fear can make men bow, but fear can also make a country lose its administrators, lose its backbone, lose the quiet machinery that keeps a state alive. Stephen began to understand. Fear alone is not enough. To survive, a small country needs something tougher than emotion. It needs structure. It needs a fortress that cannot be betrayed from within. In 1457, waiting ended. Vlad seized the throne of Wallachia and became the figure history would call the Impaler. And in that moment, when fire took the southern throne, Vlad did not forget his fellow exile. He gave Stephen 6,000 Wallachian soldiers, not a blessing, a loan, paid in blood. And Vlad pointed north. Moldavia was there. Petru Aron, the usurper, was there. Stephen marched home. But he was no longer the boy who ran from a wedding feast. He returned as a man carrying a debt that had to be repaid. The decisive battle came at Dolgesti. Wind tore across open ground. Mud clung to boots. Crushed grass mixed with the hot iron smell of weapons. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a sentencing. Stephen's men shattered Petru Aron's formation. The usurper escaped into Poland, beginning a long hunt that would haunt Stephen for years. But politically, Moldavia had changed hands. Stephen took the throne at 24. His coronation was not gold and incense inside a radiant church. By accounts, it was held outdoors, in a field, a ceremony of iron, witnessed by the soldiers who had bled for him. And when the crown was placed on his head, Stephen looked down the line of boyars, Moldavia's nobles. They had bowed to his father, then bowed to Petru Aron. Now they bowed to him. And in that instant, Stephen understood something cold. The greatest enemy was not at the border. He was standing inside the court. Boyar loyalty was thin as morning mist. When the sun of power shifts, the mist disappears, and they bow to someone else. Many boyars believed they had placed a puppet on the throne, a young prince they could steer, threaten, replace. They did not understand. During exile, Stephen learned more than survival. He learned how to dismantle a system of betrayal, bone by bone. In Wallachia, Vlad solved the boyar problem with violence like a sledgehammer. He invited nobles to a feast, asked how many princes they had served, then impaled them, while the banquet continued. It worked, but it left a country paralyzed by fear, and a king isolated. Stephen chose a path more dangerous and more durable. He didn't just want to kill traitors. He wanted to change the structure of power, so betrayal became harder to commit. The purges began, but not as an explosion of rage, more like surgery. Anyone who showed even a spark of disloyalty, a secret letter, a corridor whisper, lost land. Some were executed. But the truly terrifying part came after: redistribution. Stephen seized estates from the old boyar families, men who believed they were born to rule, and granted them to a new layer he called the vitaji, the brave ones. They were not necessarily high nobility. They could be minor nobles, free peasants, veteran soldiers who had proven themselves in blood. Stephen offered a deal as rough as the earth itself. Fight for me, bleed for me, and I will give you land, status, a voice. For the first time, a Moldavian peasant could have direct loyalty to the prince, without passing through a local lord. It was a quiet revolution. And it had a massive consequence. Stephen could summon up to 40,000 men, not because they were forced by lords, but because they owned a piece of this country. But loyal soldiers were not enough. Stephen turned to something tougher than blood and oaths: stone, mortar, walls. He launched a vast fortification program, turning Moldavia into a hedgehog of thorns. The jewel of this network was the fortress of Suceava. Stephen didn't just patch old walls. He redesigned them: thicker stone, deeper moats, firing platforms, all meant to face the new war god rising across Europe: gunpowder artillery. Suceava became Stephen-made physical, hard, dark, unmoving. Inside, he stockpiled grain, weapons, gold, not to boast, but to tell every noble thinking of revolt and every empire watching from the frontier: the age of weak Moldavian princes is over. The old boyars hated him. They sent secret letters to Hungary, to Poland, even to the Ottomans, begging someone to lift Stephen off the throne. But Stephen moved first. He built an intelligence network. Information seeped through the palace like water through soil. Whispers were heard before they finished. By the early 1460s, Moldavia, once notorious for chaos, had become strangely stable. A firm throne, a full treasury, a loyal army, a country with a spine. And just as Stephen finished bolting the doors of his house, the southern neighbor began to burn. In Wallachia, Vlad Dracula was provoking a monster no one could defeat in single combat. He stopped paying tribute to the Ottomans. He launched terror raids against Turkish forces. He wanted fear to become a border. The Ottoman response was inevitable. Stephen watched the storm rising. He owed Vlad a life debt for those 6,000 men in 1457. By honor, he should have ridden south and stood beside Vlad against the Islamic invasion. But Stephen did not live by knightly honor. He lived by the ruthless logic of power. Moldavia had only just been rebuilt. If I ride into Vlad's cyclone, I may lose everything. And then Stephen fixed his gaze on a target that would shock Christendom, a place that was more than a fortress. It was the economic lung of the region, Chilia, at the mouth of the Danube. Whoever held Chilia controlled trade between the Black Sea and Central Europe. Stephen understood. If Moldavia wanted to live, it needed that lung. He could not allow it to fall to the Ottomans, and he could not leave it in the hands of a cousin who was setting himself on fire. Summer 1462. Sultan Mehmed VI marched a massive army into Wallachia to crush Vlad. This should have been the moment of Christian unity. And while Vlad launched his famous night attack, attempting to assassinate Mehmed, Stephen did the unthinkable. He marched on Chilia, not to save Vlad, to take the fortress from Vlad and the garrison holding it. A cold knife, a second front, opened behind an ally's back. During the siege, Stephen was hit in the ankle, a wound that would never fully heal and would follow him like a flesh and bone reminder of his own betrayal. But he continued. He besieged Chilia for 8 days, bombarded it until the defenders, Hungarian and Wallachian, surrendered. Stephen took Chilia. Emotionally, it was a stab in the back. Strategically, it was perfect. Moldavia now held the Danube Gate, locked the Black Sea against the Ottoman fleet, and secured its economic lifeline. Stephen knew Vlad would fall. Vlad was hated by Wallachian boyars. He was isolated. No one came to save him. And exactly as Stephen calculated, Vlad was soon forced to flee into Hungary. But the bitterness was this. He was not captured by the Turks. He was imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus. The Hungarian king Stephen would later humiliate Baia. The Ottomans installed Vlad's brother in Wallachia, Radu, the Handsome, soft, pliable, loyal to the Sultan. Wallachia became a buffer, almost Ottoman. And Stephen understood the price of his surgery immediately. He kept the Danube lung, but he lost the dragon to the south. No more Vlad to draw Ottoman attention. The road to Moldavia stood open. Stephen stood alone. Behind him, the stone walls he had built. Before him, an empire that had devoured Constantinople and was still hungry. In the years that followed, Stephen prepared like a man who could hear death's footsteps from far away. Slow, steady, never stopping. He reinforced fortresses. He stockpiled food. He tightened the vitegi. And then one day, he did something the Ottomans could not ignore. He stopped paying the annual tribute, a small act on paper. But for Mehmed Sultan, this was never about money. It was about submission. And when a small spark in the north dares to say no, sooner or later, the sky answers with thunder. By 1474, the summons of war began to form, like a black cloud rolling north from the south, up the Danube, carrying a name that would enter the fear of this land. Suleiman Pasha. That name didn't ring like a legend, but in the 15th century, it carried the weight of a sentence. Suleiman was not reckless. He was a hardened commander, trusted by Sultan Mehmed II with missions that were not allowed to fail. And this time, the order was simple. Cruel, clear. Crush Moldavia. Break Stephen. Turn this land into a stepping stone toward Poland and Hungary. The force Suleiman brought was almost beyond medieval imagination, around 120,000 people. Not just an army, a country on the move. Soldiers, cannons, horses, wagons of grain, cattle, camp servants, a human river stretching for miles, making the earth tremble like an approaching storm. In those ranks were the Janissaries, Christian children taken, remade into fanatical soldiers of Islam. There were the Sipahi, elite cavalry, the pride of the empire, and behind them, the shadow of Mehmed II, not present in person, but present in every order, every timetable, every ruthless expectation. And facing them, what did Stephen have? Around 40,000, and most were not professionals. They were razesh, free peasants, men carrying spears, axes, bows, and one single reason to fight. This is our home. On paper, it was a death warrant, 3-1, an empire against a small principality. But Stephen saw what Suleiman ignored: time, weather, terrain. The invasion came late in 1474. Winter was closing the door. Moldavia's sky turned the color of lead. The ground became mud. Nights grew long, cold enough to bite bone. And Stephen decided to turn his homeland into a weapon. The order went out, an order that made people tremble. Leave the enemy. Nothing. Villages emptied, livestock driven deep into the woods, granaries stripped bare, wells fouled, dead animals, crude poisons, not out of cruelty, out of survival. Imagine you are an Ottoman soldier. You've marched hundreds of kilometers, boots soaked, clothes heavy, stomach hollow. You step into a village, and there is nothing. No bread, no meat, no voices, only wind whistling through empty windows, and the damp stench of abandonment. You're thirsty. You lean over a well, and you don't dare drink. In the forests, Stephen didn't fight battles. He bled people. Moldavian light cavalry appeared like ghosts, loosing arrows from the tree line, slashing at supply wagons, then vanishing before the Sipahi could even turn. Men who drifted from formation never returned. Sleep became a nightly ritual of listening. Ears strained for the sound of footsteps in the dark. The gigantic army began to rot from the inside. But Suleiman Pasha kept advancing. He believed that if he could force Stephen into a decisive battle, numbers would crush every trick. His target was Suceava, the heart of Moldavia. He did not know Stephen had chosen the operating table weeks earlier. Near the town of Vasilui, there was a narrow valley, swampy and tight, and winter turned it into a trap. Mud thick as porridge, fog so dense you couldn't see the tip of your spear. That was where Stephen wanted the enemy to come. Morning, January 10th, 1475. The sun did not rise. At least, no one saw it. Fog smothered the Barlad Valley like a burial shroud. Sound was strangled. Footsteps seemed to echo from far away, even when they were only meters apart. Suleiman ordered the advance across the raised bridge, funneling Ottoman formations into the valley's belly. In the fog, tens of thousands pushed forward, blind, not knowing what waited ahead. They thought they were entering a battlefield. In reality, they were stepping into a killing box. When the Sipahi drove their horses forward, the ground did not spring. It swallowed. Horses slipped. Hooves sank. Heavy armor dragged riders downward. The pride of Ottoman cavalry, caught like insects, trapped in hardened resin. Then, the cannons spoke. Stephen had placed artillery on the hillsides. In the fog, they didn't need perfect aim. The enemy was packed too densely to miss. Cannonballs tore into janissary blocks, and the blasts rolled back in the valley as a chain of low, monstrous thunder. But that was only the overture. From deep in the woods, music rose. Brass horns screamed, drums hammered. Battle signals echoed from a direction that made no sense. In the fog, it sounded like a new army arriving. Suleiman panicked. He ordered his formations to pivot, to face the invisible threat. But in the forest, there was no army, only sound. And when the Ottomans turned their backs, Stephen struck for real. Moldavian infantry, peasants with long axes, scythes, spears, burst out of the fog. They did not fight Kosovo. They fought like men defending roofs, Children, graves. Metal smashed into wood. Axes hooked riders off horses. Men slid into mud. Trampled. Dragged. Swallowed. The bridge became a death bottleneck. Those who didn't die by weapons, drowned in freezing mire. When the fog finally thinned, the ground revealed a color that sickens the mind. A pale gray-white of churned mud and dead flesh. Around 40,000 Ottomans did not leave that valley. More than 100 banners were captured. 4 pashas were killed. It was the heaviest Ottoman defeat against a Christian leader, up to that point. Stephen rode across the field. Corpses lay piled. The smell was mud mixed with blood, hot, sour, metallic. He did not celebrate, because he understood. He had only angered a giant. He wrote to the Pope and Europe's kings, "I have cut off the pagan's right arm, but the other arm is coming." And it did. Europe drank the victory like wine. They called Stephen the athlete of Christ. But letters don't stop cannonballs. Summer, 1476. Mehmed II decided to hunt personally. He brought an even larger army and a cruel move, an alliance with the Crimean Tatars to strike Moldavia from the east. Stephen faced an equation with no elegant solution. As the Tatars poured in, raiding and burning, Moldavian peasants, his soldiers, begged to go home to protect their families. Stephen let them go. A soldier thinking about a burning home is already dead on the battlefield. He was left with around 10,000 professionals, and Mehmed II was coming. Stephen chose his ground at Valea Alba, the White Valley, dense forest, narrow earth. And when the Ottomans entered, Stephen set the woods on fire. Smoke, flame, trees collapsing. The Janissaries fought inside a gigantic oven. They coughed. They went blind. They died. But numbers are numbers. Mehmed unleashed the royal guard. The Moldavian line broke, not defeated, crushed. Bodies were so many that years later people said white bones covered the valley. And that is how the name Valea Alba was born. Stephen escaped, but he lost men. He lost land. He lost almost everything. Mehmed marched toward Suceava, believing the game was over. And here, legend collides with history. Stephen, wounded, exhausted, came to a fortress where his mother was sheltering and begged to be let in. The gates did not open. From the wall, his mother spoke, though time may have sharpened the words into steel. "I am the mother of a victor, not a fugitive. Go back, win and return, or die out there." Stephen turned away, not broken. He vanished into the mountains. Mehmed reached Suceava and met stone. The fortress did not open. Cannons answered cannons. Ottoman supplies ran thin. Disease spread. The land had been burned bare. And in the end, Mehmed, conqueror of Constantinople, ordered a retreat. Stephen emerged from the forests, not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a survivor. But as the Ottomans pulled back, a new threat began to show its face. Not from the south, but from the north. Poland was watching Moldavia bleed and smiling. Poland did not arrive like an enemy. They arrived wearing the face of an ally. Royal letters, sealed in wax, spoke of crusade, of retaking Black Sea ports from the infidel. That familiar language, moral, noble, righteous, has been used to hide an awful lot of knives in Eastern Europe's history. Stephen was too old to believe words, but he was also too tired to create another enemy. Not yet. In 1497, King John Albert of Poland gathered a large army and marched south. Stephen prepared to support him, at least in name. He watched every movement, every campfire, every road they chose. And then, the mask fell. Instead of turning toward the Ottomans, the Polish army marched straight for Suceava. the capital of Moldavia. Not a crusade, not liberation. A coup. John Albert intended to depose Stephen and place his own brother on Moldavia's throne, turning the land into a northern vassal. A stab in the back, wrapped in holy cloth. Stephen did not scream. He did not send messengers to curse the Poles. He closed the gates. For 3 weeks, Polish cannons roared against Suceava's walls. Shots bounced back like stones thrown at a cliff. The walls Stephen built were not meant to impress. They were born to endure. Meanwhile, Moldavian detachments cut supply lines. The forest swallowed food. Mud held the wagons. Disease began seeping through the Polish camp, like the smell of spoiled meat. John Albert realized his glorious campaign was turning into disaster. He asked to withdraw. Stephen agreed, but with one condition. The Polish army would retreat by the same road it had come, through the muddy fields, through the villages it had plundered. It would not cut through the rich northern forests. John Albert swore he would keep his word. And then, he betrayed it. The Polish army turned into the Kosmin Forest, a maze of oak and thorny beech, tight, dark ravines, where sunlight is shredded by dense canopy. Stephen had been waiting there. October 26, 1497, when Polish heavy cavalry entered the forest, they did not hear challenge horns. Only silence. And then the forest collapsed. Great trees had been pre-cut, almost severed, camouflaged with moss and leaves. When the column pushed deeper, Moldavian hands shoved. Wood cracked. Trees fell like dominoes. Horses were crushed. Knights trapped in heavy armor. Formation shattered before the first arrow even flew. And then, from every direction, Moldavian peasants surged in, not like a neat army, like a flood. Polish armor, built for open fields, became a chain. Mud grabbed boots. Roots seized horses. Men were dragged down, disarmed, bound. This was not a battle. It was the collapse of pride. Stephen captured thousands, including many Polish nobles. He did not kill them. He did not demand ransom. He did something more humiliating than death. He forced them to break their swords, the symbol of noble blood, and forge them into plow blades. Then he tied knights to the plows and made them plow the very soil they had come to seize, planting oak acorns into it. Picture it. Men who believed they were born to command, sweat pouring down their faces, backs bent, feet sinking into mud, being shouted at by peasants they once despised. They say the oak forests of Bukovina today rose from those seeds, planted with the tears of aristocrats. And that was Stephen's final lesson to the West. Titles will not save you. Blue blood will not hide you. If you come to this land as a conqueror, you will leave it as a servant. Stephen had beaten Hungary. He had pushed back the Ottomans. He had humiliated Poland. Moldavia's borders held by iron, mud, and human bone. But no enemy is more terrifying than time. By the late 15th century, Stephen was an old man by medieval standards. More than 40 years in the saddle left marks, white hair, creased skin, and pain that never left his body. That ankle wound, received at Chilia in 1462 in the campaign where he betrayed Vlad, never healed. It smoldered for 4 decades. Now, it began to rot. Infection spread. Stephen had to be carried on a litter. The best physicians were summoned, from Venice, Genoa, Nuremberg, and their methods were rituals of torture in the name of medicine. Red-hot iron, burned flesh, trying to cauterize what they didn't understand. Imagine ruling a country with pain eating into your bones like fire. Receiving ambassadors while cold sweat soaks your back. Making strategic decisions while each heartbeat is a knife. Stephen endured, not for glory, for responsibility. In his final years, he withdrew to Putna Monastery, the first foundation stone he laid as a young man, not to flee, to measure the future. He looked at Europe's map and saw what no one wanted to say aloud. Hungary weakening, Poland treacherous, the West indifferent, the Ottomans growing stronger. The gate he had held for half a century would eventually break. It was only a question of time. Stephen understood he could not live forever to hold a sword. So he made his final move, a move that stunned the court. From his sickbed, Stephen called his son Bogdan III. He did not say, "Fight to the last man." He did not call for martyrdom. He spoke one sentence that sounded like betrayal of his entire life. "Submit to the Sultan." July 2nd, 1504. Putna's bells rang. The sound rolled through valleys, villages, forests, and a country went quiet. Stephen the Great died. At first glance, his last counsel looks like defeat. But look closer, and it is the last surgery. Stephen understood Moldavia was too small to fight the Ottomans forever. His goal was never to destroy the empire. His goal was to survive inside its shadow. Because of the catastrophic losses Stephen inflicted, Vaslui, Valea Alba, countless ambushes, the Ottomans respected Moldavia and feared it. So when Moldavia accepted vassalage, it was not turned into an Ottoman province. No pasha governing, no mosques rising everywhere, no land handed to Turkish settlers. Moldavia kept its laws, its army, its church, its prince. The Ottomans took gold and a promise of loyalty. That arrangement, autonomy within empire, is one reason Romania exists today as a Latin island in a Slavic sea. So why does the world remember Vlad Dracula and forget Stephen the Great? Because Vlad is a monster. Simple, shocking, easy to tell. Stephen is complicated. He burned villages. He executed nobles. He betrayed his cousin. And he also built churches, protected peasants, and held the soul of a people together. He does not belong in a horror novel. He belongs in the quiet sanctum of great statesmen. If you visit Putna today, you can see his grave. White stone, simple. No spikes, no vampire legend. Only an inscription. The most glorious prince. The Ottoman Empire fell. The Polish kingdom is gone. Hungary was shattered. But Moldavia, the heart of Romania, lived. Because 500 years ago, one man accepted the role of history's surgeon. He cut. He burned. He endured pain. Not to boast of victory, but to keep the patient breathing. Stephen the Great did not just hold the line. He drew it. And he drew it in iron, so deep that 5 centuries of wind and war could not erase it. So the next time you hear the name Dracula, remember the cousin standing in the shadows. The one who did not merely frighten the darkness, but built a light strong enough to keep it from flooding in.